Yeah. Hi everyone, my name is Garrett Northcutt, and I'm here today to tell you a little bit about the world of whiskey and how many different variations there are out there. Everybody typically knows the household spirits of Jack Daniels, Maker's Mark, Jim Beam, and Evan Williams, but did you know that India's greatest export in the spirit industry is actually an Indian variation of whiskey, as well as Israel and Iceland are also known for their different types of whiskeys. With so many different types of whiskeys out there in the world, what we're going to be focusing on today are three major types. We're going to be looking at American-made whiskey, Scottish whiskey, and Irish whiskey. Whiskey is something that has transcended millennia and often is a social and cultural important item. It brings together a lot of people from different backgrounds into the same setting to enjoy the beverage. Personally, I have been collecting whiskey for a little under 2 years now, so I'm relatively new to the topic, but I do have a friend that I often go to who I consider to be somewhat of a whiskey expert that I take any questions or any suggestions towards. So today, again, I'll be talking to you about three different types of whiskey: the American-made whiskey, Scottish whiskey, and Irish. Within each, I'll be talking a little bit about the distillation process and the rules on how it's made, as well as the different characteristics, including color and tasting notes. So first, let's start with our first whiskey, American-made. Being one of the newest forms of whiskey in the world, there are a lot of people who are giving American-made whiskey a lot of attention. There are three different types of American-made whiskey out there, the first one being bourbon. So in order to be a bourbon, you have to have a 51% or more corn mixture mash. That's very important as it gives a lot of its flavor from that. It also has to be distilled less than 160 proof, but greater than 80 proof. So that's 80% alcohol versus 40% alcohol. It has to be between those guidelines. It also has to be matured in a brand new charred oak barrel. That's extremely important. It's the only barrel that's very specific in being brand new. It also cannot be introduced into the barrel at higher than 125 proof. If it gets to 160 inside the barrel, that's fine, just can't be introduced over 125 beforehand. It also has to sit in the barrel for a minimum of 2 years inside the United States. That's important. A lot of people think it's just Kentucky, but it doesn't matter. It has to be inside the United States. A lot of the characteristics you're going to get with bourbon, as shown a little bit from this bottle, is you're going to get kind of a rich auburn color, as well as some very spicy notes, which is the characteristic of bourbon. It's going to burn a little bit more. You're also on the back end going to get a lot of sweet vanilla flavoring. The next whiskey we're going to be looking at is a rye. It's extremely similar to bourbon in that all of its rules are the same except for its ingredients. It has to be used 51% or more rye mash, hence its name, rye whiskey. So a lot of the characteristics you're going to get out of this are very similar to bourbon. You can notice that the coloring is relatively close to the same as normal bourbon, but what you're going to get is you're going to get more of a darker auburn color than normal bourbon because of the rye mash. But on the back end, you're going to get more sweet flavors. So this bottle, for instance, is going to have more of a peppermint taste, whereas the bourbon is going to be more of a spice taste. So your last whiskey, an American-made, is Tennessee whiskey. Being in Clarksville, I felt that this was a very appropriate topic to talk about with Jack Daniels. But it has to be made as a bourbon. Very specific, has to follow all the same rules as bourbon, but the difference is at the end of the distillation process, it has to be filtered through maple charcoal, which is a very interesting twist because what it does is it takes out the harshness of whiskey and puts in and adds more of a sweet flavor to the whiskey at the end of the process. So naturally, you're going to get a little bit lighter of a coloring than a normal bourbon would, but you're going to get more sweet flavors than you would with a typical barrel strength bourbon. So now we're going to jump across the pond and look at Scottish whiskey. So typically, by the book Whiskey by Science Direct, it's officially been coined as Scotch. but it's typically joined with the idea of wealth and prosperity and is often used as a tool with ending agreements between businesses or celebration. So it's a more of a social item now than it is just a normal beverage. The rules to create a scotch is that it can only be made of water and malted barley, and it has proofing rules of no more than 94% alcohol and no less than 40% alcohol. Has to be matured in an oak barrel for 3 years minimum, and has to be made in Scotland if you're catching a trend. A lot of its coloring, as you can see, it's a lot lighter than American-made whiskey. That's because of its malted barley. It's going to give more of a sweet and floral tasting notes instead of having the spice, so it's a lot less. You're still going to taste the alcohol, but it's not going to have as much as a burn. So moving on to Irish whiskey, lastly, is having one of the most distinct brand names in the world. Jameson whiskey is a global sellout. The rules on how they create their whiskey is using the similar items of Scotch, same proofing rules, same barreling rules, but they're allowed to add more than just malted barley to their drink. So they're able to add other cereal grains. This bottle is a little hard to see the coloring notes because they use a green tint on the bottle, but essentially you're going to get the same kind of golden caramel color and getting a lot of fruity and floral tasting notes, but it all ultimately depends on what type of cereal grains they use. So in conclusion, today we learned a little bit about the different variations of whiskey, some of the main features and types and variations of the American-made Scotch and Irish whiskey. I hope you find this newfound knowledge to enjoy a lot of the different beverages that are out there in the world and possibly finding yourself a bottle with this information. But I would like to remind people to always drink and consume responsibly and always plan to have a designated driver before drinking or consuming any alcohol, as well as never operating any equipment or vehicle while under the influence of alcohol. Thanks.